Caseus. Jedi Redeemed. Chapter 21. The night air was crisp and cold on Blengeel. The suns had just set, and the wreck of the Praxium cruiser sat gently silhouetted against the fading skyline. From the jagged hole they used for an entrance, Dravok emerged and wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his robe. Caseus emerged soon after, tired and sore, but growing stronger by the day. "Commander?" Looking to the shuttle, Caseus saw Juro holding a box as he stepped off the ramp. "Hey, Juro. Got the water?"
"Well, yes. But I found something on my last run and figured, why not?"
Opening the box, Juro revealed a case of glass bottles as Caseus raised an eyebrow. "Ale?"
"Straight from Corellia."
Caseus looked at the bottles and closed the box. "I'm okay. Gotta stay focused."
"With all respect, sir, I haven't seen you take a well-deserved break in 6 months. Just tonight, relax. You can get back to it in the morning. I think you could do with a drink."
Caseus looked at Juro and smiled kindly. "What the hell?" Opening the box back up, Caseus reached in with Juro as they both grabbed a drink, cracking the tops and clinking the bottles together before taking a long, refreshing swig. Smacking his lips, Juro looked over to Dravok sitting on the edge of the cruiser, looking out over the endless ocean of sand and wrecked ships. Caseus looked to Dravok and over to the box. Sighing, he grabbed a bottle from the case and walked over to the disheveled man. Looking up, Dravok saw the boy holding out the drink. Part of him wanted to smack it away and chastise him, but he didn't. To his own surprise, Dravok took the bottle and opened it, as Caseus sat by him. No words were exchanged for several minutes, until Dravok spoke up.
"Warm ale. How thoughtful."
"Well, if you want something cold, I think I saw a bar somewhere out in the dunes. You should go look for it."
"You still have your sense of humor. Guess I can't expect that to mature."
The two Jedi continued their drinks as the cries of distant sand burrowers echoed through the night sky. "What's our plan for tomorrow?"
"Same as today. Don't get too used to this. We're not on vacation."
"I know. I have to ask. What makes you so sure we can pull this off?" Dravok glared at Caseus as he took another sip.
"There's no certainty, boy. We find a way and we kill him. That's it."
"What if we can't?"
"There is no I can't. Not here. If you go in with doubts in your mind, you've already lost. You can't be held back by your own fear. You need to be in control. Not in a passive sense either. Harness it. Use it. You're afraid? Good. Use that fear to motivate you. You're angry? Even better. Anger, when controlled, is a fire that isn't easy to extinguish. But the second you allow fear or anger to convince you that you're going to fail, it's over."
Caseus looked at his drink and back to Dravok. "You're not afraid?"
"No."
"How?"
"How what?"
"How can you not be afraid, knowing the odds are against us?"
"The odds have always been against me. I've escaped certain death more times than I can imagine. One of these days my luck will run out. I've accepted that. But I'm not accepting death until it takes me. Until then, I'm fighting."
Dravok finished his drink and threw the empty bottle out into the desert below and stood.
"Get some sleep. We start again at first light."
Caseus looked at Dravok as he stepped back into the cruiser before finishing his drink and heading to bed. On Yavin, Caseus stepped out of his quarters and shut the door before heading to the hangar and looking upon the nebulous. It was flying again. The dents and scrapes along the hull told tales of hardship and trial, but it was flying.
"Captain?"
Caseus smiled and saw Pip run over.
Hey there, oil stain.
Where have you been? I've been scouring any trace I could find, but you just vanished.
Well, I'm here now. And I'm gonna need your help with something.
Sure, anything.
Caseus knelt down.
It's risky. And it might get us into a bit of hot water with the higher-ups.
Please, Risky is my middle name.
Caseus smirked.
What's your last name?
Okay, fair enough. What do you need, Captain?
I need to send a signal out to the Empire. A signal that I know will reach Vader and Liara.
Okay, having a little trouble following your logic, but I can probably do that. What else?
That's it.
That's it? Just like that?
Just like that.
Well, okay. I'll see what I can do. I'll call you when we're ready.
Caseus nodded and saluted Pip, who returned the gesture and went on his way. Over in the corner, Caseus saw Bendel sitting alone, holding his injured arm in a sling. Walking over, Caseus sat in front of him. Crash is dead.
I heard. I'm sorry, Bendel.
I'll bet you are.
I am.
Bendel narrowed his eyes and looked at Caseus.
What are you doing back here anyway? I thought you gave up.
Guess I finally came to my senses.
Too little, too late.
Caseus looked into Bendel's eyes.
It's never too late. I will tell you. I'm not going to be here on Yavin much longer. I'm going to find Liara.
Bendel stayed quiet.
I know what she did. But you and I both know that's not Liara. Not our Liara. I'm going to bring her home. After that, we're leaving this war behind.
Of course you are. God forbid you do your share around here.
I know you're angry. I guess there's not much I can say to ease things right now. I need to know. Is Haji still here?
Far as I know. Why?
Caseus stood and started walking to the detention area.
Where are you going?
Caseus turned and looked at the young man.
Like I said, it's never too late.
Bendel shook his head as Caseus walked through the halls to the detention area. The cells were empty, but from a nearby window, Caseus saw Haji accompanied by rebel security out by the rainforest. Stepping down the steps and out the door, the rebel soldiers stood at attention as Caseus walked over.
I'd like to speak with the boy for a moment.
As Caseus gestured to the side, the soldiers nodded and walked off, leaving Caseus and Haji alone.
What do you want?
Liara's alive.
Haji's eyes suddenly shot towards Caseus in surprise.
What?
That's all I'm at liberty to tell you right now. I want to talk to you, though.
Why?
Caseus walked to Haji and, using the force, removed his restraints. In shock, Haji felt his wrists and looked at Caseus.
What are you doing?
I'm giving you a choice, Haji. Look at where you are. Look at what's happened to you in the past months. You've been locked away because of your actions. Actions you convinced yourself were to avenge your father. That cause was dead from the beginning. When you joined with Dotami Fortuan, there were very few favorable outcomes for your future. Now it's time for you to decide.
Decide what?
You're free from your restraints. You can run. Go and start a new life. Get married, settle down, start a business. What you do with your life from this moment on is yours to decide. But there's another choice. That temple, there's boys in there younger than you, doing their part in restoring freedom to the galaxy. You can do the same. When your father was offered this choice, he sided with the Empire. That was his choice. wealth and influence. And it cost him his life in the end. Don't mistake what I'm telling you. You may very well meet your end on this side of the conflict as well. Nothing is certain. But here, you won't be alone. The battles you face will be fought with others. You need to choose. Live under the Empire, or fight for a future without them.
Haji looked from the rainforest back to Caseus.
They won't accept me. They won't trust me. Then give them a reason to trust you.
Haji slicked back his green-tinted hair and sighed.
What about you? You don't really trust me, do you? After what I did? I'm not doing this because I trust you, Haji. I'm doing this because I believe people can change. Let's see if you prove me right.
Caseus held out his hand. Haji looked at it. His heart pounded before he worked up the courage and slowly shook the hand of the tired Jedi. Caseus nodded.
Troops.
The soldiers arrived and held their weapons ready upon seeing Haji freed of his restraints. Caseus put his hand over their blasters and lowered them.
No. He's ready to make a change. Contact General Press. Let him know that the Alliance has a new recruit. And Haji.
Haji looked at Caseus.
Make the most of this.
Without another word, Caseus went back inside. Walking past the nebulous, he remembered something. He had to see if it was still there. Stepping on board the ramp, Caseus looked around at the repaired interior and computers. Looking over to the cockpit, Caseus reached underneath the control terminal, into a hatch door, and rummaged around until his hands touched a small box. Grabbing it, he took it out. The present from Liara and Pip. The one he never got around to opening. With a sigh, he removed the lid and looked inside. It was a necklace. A small blue gemstone attached to a leather cord. Quite similar to the gift he had given Liara on Shulgana. The one he now wore around his own neck. He put it on, fastening it to Liara's necklace before heading off the ship, just as Pip ran over to him.
Okay, Captain. I think I've got it.
Liara landed her shuttle upon the Executor, taking slow steps towards the hangar as she made her way to Vader's chamber. She felt sick. She had one chance to lure Caseus out, and he didn't show up. Too many variables. Not enough planning. But how could she have known Caseus wouldn't show up to save Bendel and the rest, when he didn't even show up to save her? She had nothing to show for her plan except a dead Ithorian and a few rebel corpses. She couldn't breathe. With every step she took, she could feel Vader's cold presence. Passing a few officers, she stepped onto the turbolift, as it gradually made its way to the uppermost levels of the Star Destroyer. The door opened to a long, dim corridor, lit only by the lifeless glow of the lights on the walls. Before she knew it, she was standing before the door to Vader's chamber. She put in the key code, and the door opened. There, in front of his meditation chamber, Vader stood looking upon a screen. She caught only a brief glimpse of what looked like a moon. The screen shut down, and the only sounds within the room were the electric buzzing of the control terminals and the slow, methodical breathing from Vader's suit.
You have failed.
Liara knelt.
I ask for mercy, Lord Vader. I assure you that...
Vader turned with a speed she had never seen from him before as he raised his fist. Liara felt her windpipe close as she was lifted from the floor into the air.
There is no mercy.
Liara tried desperately to get even a single gasp of air into her lungs, but it was fruitless. His clutch tightened as her face started to turn red. Liara clawed at her neck, knowing deep down inside there was no escape from Vader's grasp. The Sith Lord approached her, drawing his lightsaber from his belt and igniting the crimson blade. Vader raised his weapon as Liara shut her eyes. Just as he swung, the comm systems buzzed with static and interference.
What? System. Transmission. Communication.
Vader looked up at the ceiling to the transmitters as a voice came through.
Liara, this is Caseus. I know you can hear me. I know you're listening to me right now. You lured Bendel out to Ruusan to get to me. Well, here I am. If you want to find me, then face me. Go to where you found Daku. I'll be there. Go now.
The transmission fizzled out in a blur of static and garbled audio waves. Liara opened her eyes. Chandrila. He was going back to Chandrila. Vader dropped Liara and stood over her as she coughed and gasped, taking in the precious oxygen she could.
You know where he is.
Liara looked up at Vader and nodded in fear.
Tell me where he's going, and I will make your death slip.
Liara's lips trembled as her mind raced. She had to tell him. She was stuck. But something awoke inside of her in that moment. Rage. She wouldn't give Vader the satisfaction of killing Caseus. That pleasure would be hers and hers alone. Clenching her fists, she knelt before Vader.
Yes. I know.
Where is he?
Liara looked up at Vader as strands of dark red hair hung in front of her face.
Caseus is mine.
Before Vader knew what happened, Liara used every ounce of her power and sent Vader flying back as far as she could, sending him into his open meditation chamber with a deafening smash. Just as Vader regained his footing, Liara called upon the Force and sealed the chamber before crushing it around the Dark Lord, trapping him momentarily. Taking the precious few moments she had, Liara sprinted out of Vader's quarters and down the hall to the turbo lift. The door closed just as Vader forcefully broke free from the crumpled heap and began his pursuit. The turbo lift had just reached the lower level of the Executor when the alarm sounded.
The girl is attempting to escape. Seal the airlock immediately.
Liara ran faster and faster, shoving stormtroopers aside as they too began to pursue her and fire at her. Liara had just reached the hangar when the airlock doors were beginning to close. She was out of breath, but she rushed on board her shuttle and activated the controls, flying out and clipping the edge of her wing on the door just as it shut above her. Setting coordinates for Chandrila, she jumped to light speed and was gone. In the hangar of the Executor, Vader stepped over to the airlock doors and seethed in rage. "My lord, we tried to stop..." Vader reached out and clutched the deck officer by his throat.
Prepare my ship.
On Yavin, Cassius was finishing preparations on the mineral freighter.
Captain, wait for me!
Pip ran over with his gear as Cassius held out his hand to stop him. "No, Pip. Not this time."
What? What are you talking about? I'm going with you to help Liara.
"Your place is here, Pip. This is something I have to do alone. Liara is my responsibility."
But, Captain, what if you get into trouble?
Cassius smiled a bit. "Trouble is a guarantee if you're coming along."
That's not fair! I'm always here to help you when I can. This isn't right. Liara is my friend.
Cassius knelt down. "I know, Pip. But if we're gonna have a chance at bringing her back, it has to be me. Just me. I wish I could make you understand."
Captain, what if you...
Don't think about what ifs, Pip. I need you to trust me. Do you trust me? Pip looked down and back to Cassius.
I trust you.
Good.
But why are you taking that rust bucket? The Nebulous can get you there faster.
I'll get there fast enough, Pip. With this freighter, I'll blend right in if I come across any trouble. Besides, I think it's time for a change in leadership.
What?
Caseus looked at the Nebulous and smiled.
Sabo gave me the ship when I needed it. But I think I've outgrown it. Still, the Nebulous needs a captain. I can't think of anyone more deserving than the most loyal first mate I've ever had.
Pip stepped back, shocked.
What? Me? You're giving me the Nebulous?
Caseus smiled.
On the condition that you take care of it. You promise?
Pip looked unsure.
But that would make me...
I'm short on time here, Bolthead.
Pip looked upon the Nebulous and looked back to Caseus, before standing at attention and saluting.
I won't let you down, Caseus.
Caseus smiled and saluted back. I know you won't, Captain. Now go on. They're probably going to be looking for me after that transmission. Get them off my back for a bit, will you?
Pip nodded and ran into the hangar. Just as Caseus stepped on the ramp, he heard someone call his name.
Caseus!
Caseus turned and saw Guidome running to him.
Make it quick, Guidome.
Guidome looked upon his friend.
You're sure about this? I am.
Guidome looked back at the temple.
I'll tell Bendel and the others where you went. I know they aren't in the mood to say it now, but they care about you.
Caseus nodded and looked to Guidome.
Keep them out of trouble. I can't work miracles, Caseus.
The two laughed before Guidome slowly stepped off the ramp.
May the Force be with you, Caseus Hershan. May the Force be with you, Guidome.
With a smile, Caseus stepped onto the freighter as the ramp closed. Sitting in the cockpit, he punched in coordinates to Chandrila and took off into the sky. By the time he jumped to light speed, Caseus was sure that Liara had heard him. She had to. Pulling out a data chip and inserting it into the holomap, he looked at where he was headed. Chandrila was where Liara's Jedi path began. Now it was where he would face his true test as a master. He had to draw her somewhere isolated. Somewhere remote. Not the city. Not the beaches or islands. Somewhere else. While scouring the holocron just a few hours earlier, he found records of an ancient tomb within the mountains of Chandrila. A Jedi tomb. It was secluded. Isolated. And chances are, Vader didn't know about it. He had a plan to get Liara there. The pieces were set. Now he just needed to wait. The engines were running at their full capacity by the time he reached Chandrila. Taking in the view, he closed his eyes, remembering the years he spent there training Liara in secret. He felt so much as he passed over the Silver Sea. He felt guilty that he had failed to protect her. Shame at seeing what Vader had turned her into. Resolved to do what he needed to do to make her see the light. Above all else, he felt calm. Years spent running, looking over his shoulder, trusting only in what he knew. For the first time in so long, he was ready to once again put his trust in the Force. He soon arrived to the mountains far from Chandrila's capital and set the freighter down in the canyons. A thick, dense fog clouded his sight. The ship had served its purpose in getting him here. He could make do on foot for now. Shutting off the controls, Caseus powered down the ship. All except for one device. A short-range homing beacon. Liara would find him. This would make sure of it. Stepping off the freighter, The crisp, damp air filled his lungs. Then, finding a rocky stone pathway, he started walking. He passed through narrow crevices, over steep drops in the rock, and around treacherous ledges, until he came to a clearing. There, hidden amongst the peaks of the mountains, was the tomb. He thought back to what he had seen on Korriban. The tomb of Ragnos filled him with dread. Looking upon this ancient burial place, he felt only peace. Walking over, he placed his hands upon the large stone doors and carefully pushed as they rumbled and opened. The inside was immaculate, decorated in the trappings and decor of the ancient Jedi. But it was in ruins. Fallen rocks and ancient statues had long since given way to the erosion of time and littered the cracked floor with relics of a long-gone era. Around him, holding up what remained of the massive monument, were large stone pillars, still standing strong after all these years. This was it. Sitting down, Caseus crossed his legs and faced the doors. There was no going back. Everything was set. Closing his eyes, he meditated, awaiting what was to come.
Master, be with me. Give me strength.
Liara's shuttle emerged from hyperspace and sped toward Chandrila. In the cockpit, Liara's emotions ran wild. She would find Caseus. He wouldn't hide anymore. She wouldn't allow it. She thought of Vader as well. And she laughed. She would deprive Vader of this. He had been searching for Caseus for years. Now, she would make sure he never found him. As she approached, her sensors picked up a signal from a homing beacon deep in the mountains. She locked onto it and made her descent. She got closer and closer, until she spotted the mineral freighter. She had expected the nebulous, but it didn't matter. She could sense Caseus. He was here. This is where he was. Flying as close as she could get, she set her shuttle down in the canyon and stepped out. Looking around, she could feel the ancient energy that emanated from this place, like an echo in the Force. Looking up, she could faintly make out a man-made structure set into the mountain. Then, she began to climb. Inside the tomb, Caseus took slow, deep breaths. He could sense Liara getting closer and closer. Her energy was cold, dark, full of pain. I know you can hear me, Master. I won't fail you. There is no emotion. There is peace. There is no ignorance. There is knowledge. There is no passion. There is serenity. There is no chaos. There is harmony. Before he could finish, his eyes shot open. She was here. Standing up, Caseus looked at the stone doors of the tomb as a figure approached. Liara. Caseus' heart sank as he saw her, her eyes full of anger, her once vibrant red hair disheveled and unkempt, her once fair skin pale and scarred. But it was still her. Liara locked her gaze upon Caseus as she stepped closer. Soon, she was but a mere 10 feet away from him. They said nothing. The only sounds coming from the gusting winds outside and the lone call of a bird in the distance.
Well?
Caseus closed his eyes.
Liara.
Liara twitched in anger as she bared her teeth.
Look at me!
I am. And I don't much like what I see. Liara, I need you to listen to me.
No! You listen! I'm not your student anymore! I'm through with your lectures and your cowardice. Is this why you called me here? To talk?
Caseus stayed silent and looked upon Liara.
Did you think that by calling me here, you could somehow undo what happened? That everything would go back to how it was? Look at me! There is no going back! Because of you!
I'm not the one who turned you into this, Liara. Vader did.
No, Caseus. Everything that's happened is because of you. You were the one who took me from my home. You trained me. You made me. You took me under your wing. You promised me that you wouldn't let anything happen to me. But when everything fell apart, where were you? You abandoned me.
Vader has poisoned your mind, Liara. And you know it. When Dotame and his men attacked us, I thought you were dead. I was taken away and enslaved for years. Every day, I thought about what happened to you. About my failure. I couldn't get you out of my mind. Then I learned the truth. I saw what Vader did to you. You're right. I failed to protect you like I promised you. Like I promised your mother. And for that, I'm sorry.
You're sorry? There is no apology that can fix this. Don't you see? You mean nothing to me anymore. The Empire, the Jedi, Vader, all of it could burn today, and the only thing I would regret is that I didn't see the truth long ago. I thought you were a brave Jedi once. I looked up to you. But you were a coward. Always hiding when we could have done so much more. Being so much more. Now look at you. You're a tired old man. With nothing.
Caseus stepped closer.
And you've become something far less. You were once a kind, beautiful soul that brought me out of the darkest point in my life. You gave me hope. If I could go back and tell that girl everything I should have, I would.
But you can't. That girl is dead.
That's what you think. But you're wrong, Liara. I know Vader hasn't broken you entirely. That girl from Dantooine is still inside of you. But your anger and pain is keeping her chained. You need to let it go.
Stop talking!
You are not Vader's slave. You are Liara Sinda. You are a Jedi.
Enough!
Liara screamed in rage as she drew her saber and swung at her old master as Caseus evaded the attack and blocked the following strike with his blade.
I won't abandon you to the dark side. You need to resist.
Liara swung with blinding speed as her blade clashed with his. Sparks flew and illuminated the shadows as master and apprentice fought. Caseus tried to disarm Liara with a kick, but Liara was faster and grabbed his foot and twisted, dropping Caseus to the floor. Her blade plunged downward, nearly piercing him through his eye, but Caseus rolled out of the way and got back to his feet, blocking another strike from Liara's saber. Caseus tried to read her movements, the way he used to when they sparred, but Liara had grown stronger. Vader's training was unfamiliar to him. Every attempt to turn the battle in his favor proved pointless. Liara's strikes were fueled by her rage. He could see nothing in her eyes but a fierce determination to kill him. Blocking an attack to his knees, Caseus twisted and hit Liara in the back of her head with his metal hand, stunning her briefly. Caseus again attempted to disarm her, but Liara rammed her elbow into his ribs and pushed him off before throwing her saber towards him. Caseus dodged just before the blade sliced his throat and threw his own saber towards her legs as she leapt out of the way, attempting to call her saber back to her hand, but Caseus called it as well. The two Jedi were now struggling and fighting over the amethyst blade before Liara instead used the Force to shove it forward, igniting the blade as it flew at Caseus, who ducked as the saber stabbed into the wall beside him. Just as he turned his gaze back to Liara, she leapt at him, grabbing his hair and smashing her knee into his jaw. Caseus threw his hands up as she continued to assault him with kicks and punches before Caseus let out a cry of anger and sent Liara flying back with a Force repulse. Liara collided with one of the stone pillars as Caseus called his saber back to his hand and rushed at her. Liara likewise pulled her weapon back and blocked a slice to her arm. The blades of violet and green pressed against each other as they hissed and crackled. Caseus didn't want to hurt her, but she needed to be stopped. He had to subdue her in any way he could. Liara quickly moved and angled her blade to the side and ducked out of harm's way before unleashing a relentless flurry against Caseus, his mastery of Sarisu keeping him alive. Caseus quickly switched his style and unleashed a flurry of Makashi strikes, forcing Liara on the defensive before the two were soon feeding off the energy of the battle, their adrenaline fueling them. Every strike, every parry, every movement felt as though it were happening in slow motion. They knew each other, how the other fought, but only one could be victorious. Caseus spun his saber in a quick flourish, catching Liara off guard. Just as he set a Force push at her, Liara did the same, and both were sent flying back to opposite ends of the tomb, colliding with cold, hard stone. The two of them stood, dazed and tired. Liara glared at Caseus, who returned the gaze, as they sprinted towards each other, leaping in the air and colliding blades before landing. Again and again they struck, the sounds of their battle echoing throughout the tomb until Caseus caught Liara's saber in a downward bind. Liara, faster than he could blink, flipped over Caseus and called her saber to her hand and sliced at his neck. Caseus blocked the attack, but Liara anticipated this and kicked Caseus in his lower back, knocking him forward before calling upon the Force and sending rocks and pieces of the tomb flying at him. Caseus was pummeled and bruised, but stood and sliced through the debris before Liara rushed at him, screaming. Caseus blocked the blow, but was briefly blinded by the flash. As his eyes readjusted for just a moment, he saw Liara. Not this warped, twisted assassin, but the girl he trained. Liara noticed his momentary distraction and continued the assault, slashing again and again and again at Caseus' blade until she had knocked it from his grasp. Then, she brought her blade down. Caseus looked up and grabbed her wrists as the saber inched closer and closer to his face. His strength was waning as he looked at Liara's eyes and saw tears. Caseus quickly twisted her wrists as her blade stabbed into the ground, and before Liara knew what had happened, Caseus grabbed her and locked his arms tightly around her, keeping her in a vice grip. Liara struggled and headbutted Caseus in his forehead, but his grip tightened more and more. Liara, feeling her rage reach its boiling point, called on the Force and cried out in anger and, to her shock, sent out a blast of Force lightning that sent Caseus flying back, hitting an overturned statue on the floor and bringing him to his knees. Liara stood, shaking, her face drenched with sweat, as she called her saber back to her hand and walked over to Caseus before raising it in the air. Before she struck, she saw something around Caseus' neck. The necklace he had given her, and the one she made for him. Caseus noticed her hesitation and looked up at her. Liara. Liara trembled and looked at Caseus as her grip tightened on her weapon. Do you remember? Back on Blengale. That first night after leaving Dantooine. You were upset. You missed your mother. Liara glared at him as tears dripped from her cheeks to the floor. I remember. Because you asked me if I missed my mother. I told you how my master was like my mother to me. Liara fumed in rage as she prepared to strike. All I wanted was to one day show you the same care and love that my master showed me. I tried. I really tried. I loved you like my own child, Liara. And I think back to that sweet girl,
as she fell asleep in my arms. I think back to when she befriended a little squall and made him part of our family, traveling across the galaxy with Pip, seeing worlds I'd never dreamt I would see. Those days, those memories, watching you grow, were some of the happiest memories of my life. I'm so sorry, Liara, for everything. Whatever you do, I want you to remember me as more than what I am now. Just let me look at you. One more time.
Liara screamed as she brought her saber down and stabbed through the stone floor beside Caseus. Caseus looked at Liara as her knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor, weeping. Slowly, Caseus put his arms around her and held her as she cried into his shoulder. Then he too began to cry. All the pain, all the trauma, everything he had been through the past few years, all came to the surface as he held Liara in his arms once again.
Caseus, I'm scared. I just want to go home. I want to go home.
I know. I know.
Caseus gripped Liara tight, feeling her tremble and shake as her tears soaked through the fabric of his tunic. He never wanted to see her in this state, so scared and alone. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Caseus held her for what felt like an eternity before he looked at her. Her pale blue eyes, red and puffy from long, sleepless nights.
Come on. We need to go.
Where?
Away from all of this.
Liara looked at her master and slowly stood on her feet, weak and tired. Caseus as well stood and put her arm over him as they began to walk. Then, they felt the cold, the anger. Caseus stopped dead in his tracks as Liara closed her eyes.
He's here.
Caseus looked out at the sky and saw, breaking through the clouds above, Vader's TIE fighter.
Caseus, what do we do?
Caseus looked at Liara.
This isn't your fight anymore, Liara. I need you to run. Get to my ship. Follow the flight path in the nav computer and get back to the rebels.
Liara's eyes filled with shock.
No! Caseus, I'm not leaving you. Not now.
Caseus put his hands on her cheeks and looked into her eyes.
Liara. Go. It has to be this way.
Liara's eyes filled with tears as she hugged him tightly, feeling her master's warm embrace before slowly letting go. Caseus smiled to her.
You've made me so proud, Liara. Go.
Liara nodded and quickly ran from the tomb and into the dense fog, leading down through the canyon passage. Caseus watched as her form faded away and stood still inside the tomb. After a few minutes, Vader landed his ship in front of the ancient burial place and stepped out. Caseus was inside. Walking forward at a menacing pace, he called his weapon from his belt and clutched it tight as he stepped through the large passage and into the tomb. There, waiting for him, at the very center of the deathly quiet mausoleum, was Caseus. Vader stared at him, and Caseus stared back. Not a hint of fear in his eyes.
So, this is where you've chosen to die. A tomb.
Hello, Anakin. The chilling presence of Vader turned cold as ice as he stepped down the steps towards Caseus.
Long have you eluded me, Jedi. No longer. You will share the fate of your master and the rest of the Jedi.
Why did you do it, Skywalker? Tear down everything you were a part of. Do you have no remorse for any of it? Vader slowly started circling Caseus, who stood his ground. Was it for power? If so, congratulations. You have it. You have the galaxy in your clutches, cowering before your master. Was it worth it?
You cling so desperately to the memory of an order I have since destroyed. The Jedi are dead, Caseus Urshon. Just as you, too, will die.
Caseus turned to face Vader, keeping his gaze locked upon the cold, empty mask of the Sith Lord. You've already taken so much from me. I don't fear you anymore. I suppose I should be grateful to you for everything in some strange way. You didn't kill Liara because you thought she would be useful to you. But she's gone. You have no power over her anymore. Vader stepped forward.
The girl was only ever a means to an end. She no longer has any use for me. After I kill you, I will destroy her as well. There is no escape for either of you.
Caseus glared at his enemy. You won't kill Liara. Whatever happens here today, you'll never see her again. Just another Jedi you failed to destroy. Vader ignited his weapon.
Such confidence for one in your position. Do you truly believe you can defeat me, Caseus?
No. I don't need to defeat you. Your fate is already written. The day is coming soon where you will meet your end by another Jedi. One far stronger than either of us. Vader stood motionless. He could feel the conviction in his words. The certainty.
You have foreseen something I have not. What have you seen, Jedi?
Caseus smirked and ignited his lightsaber. That's for me to know. And you to find out, Skywalker. Caseus assumed a Sarisu stance as he kept his gaze firmly on Vader, who held his saber in front of him.
So be it.
Vader lunged forward, striking downward as Caseus deflected the strike and countered with an attack of his own. The scarlet blade of Vader pushed aside the emerald blade of his enemy as sparks flew from the impact. All at once, the memories of his battle with Vader on Castellon filled Caseus' mind. Even with Dravok's help, he had been outmatched. Vader sliced again as Caseus brought his blade up and caught the blow, the impact vibrating through his bones. Jumping back again to gain distance, he found himself knocked out of the air as Vader began to pummel him with rocks and stones. Regaining his footing, Caseus caught one of the large stones and hurled it back as it smashed against Vader's shoulder, staggering him for a moment. Caseus held his blade at the ready as Vader continued his onslaught of strikes. Caseus ducked, dodged, and parried every strike as the battle led further into the tomb. Outside, Liara ran through the canyon passage, nearly losing her footing on a ledge as the rock beneath her foot gave way. Just in time, she caught the ledge and hoisted herself up as she kept moving. She had to find Caseus' ship and get out. Her heart sank at the thought of leaving him to face Vader. For a moment, She thought of going back. She couldn't. Resisting the urge, she kept going. Finally reaching a clearing, she saw the mineral freighter perched at the top of the steep plateau and began to climb. Caseus and Vader locked blades in a fearsome struggle, the blurs of motion from their blades casting shades of green and red across the walls. Catching Caseus' blade in a bind, Vader grabbed him by the throat and threw him harshly into one of the massive stone pillars. Caseus' vision was blurred as his ears rang from the impact. All he saw was a black form and a red light heading straight towards him. Caseus ducked just before his head was removed as Vader sliced into the pillar. Caseus ran as his vision returned, trying to keep a safe distance from the Sith Lord.
There is nowhere left to hide, Jedi.
Caseus turned and saw Vader closing in on him, blade raised high. Caseus leapt away from the strike and brought his blade down onto Vader's, catching it and pinning it down before smashing his mechanical fist into the side of Vader's mask. Vader stumbled briefly before hitting Caseus in the face with his own cybernetic, nearly breaking his jaw. The impact sent Caseus tumbling back over a short ledge and onto the floor, knocking the wind out of him. It wasn't long before Vader was right above him, saber angled to skewer him into the floor. Just as the stab came, Caseus ignited his saber and swatted away the attack before swinging upward and slicing across Vader's stomach, grazing him and revealing the charred skin beneath, now glowing from the nearly fatal saber wound. Vader cried out in anger and swung again as Caseus ducked out of the way, this strike so close it sliced through a lock of his dark brown hair. Vader kept up his assault as Caseus blocked and traded vicious strikes against Vader before their blades caught once more in a bind. Caseus scowled at Vader, who pressed his blade harder. In one quick movement, Caseus dropped his left hand from his hilt and drew the briar pistol from his holster and fired at Vader, striking his cybernetic leg. Vader withdrew from the bind in an instant and pulled the pistol from Caseus' grip, crushing it in his fist before throwing his saber with all his might. Caseus leapt over and evaded a fatal blow, but the Sith Lord's blade sliced his right shoulder below his neck. As he landed, Caseus grimaced, holding his arm. But Vader would not let up. He wouldn't give him any chance to recover. Caseus defended himself, but every attack he blocked caused searing pain to his shoulder. Using the Force, Caseus moved a rock from just behind Vader and caused it to knock the Sith Lord off balance long enough for Caseus to send him flying into another pillar. This time, Caseus rushed at Vader, swinging at his helmet. Vader blocked and tried to twist his blade to impale Caseus. But Caseus moved to the side, evading the strike and cutting through the pillar just as Vader grabbed his wrist and hoisted him up to try and stab him. Thinking fast, Caseus thrust his left hand forward, jabbing his metal hand into Vader's injured side, forcing Vader to lose his grip and giving Caseus an opening as he struck his blade across Vader's back. Vader howled and swung his saber at Caseus in a mighty rage. The impact sent a wave of pain into the Jedi's shoulder as Vader struck again and again. He was on his knees as the blade of Vader pressed down upon his. His elbow began to buckle as he tried rolling back, but Vader slammed the heel of his foot onto Caseus' ribs, cracking them. Caseus shook in pain as he crawled from Vader, who stood over Caseus and struck down. Caseus was nearly cleaved in two by the strike, but moved just in time and leapt in the air on top of a decaying statue of a Jedi. Vader looked up and called out with the Force, causing the statue to crumble with Caseus on it. Caseus lost his footing and tumbled harshly to the floor, taking the blunt of the impact on his back. He couldn't breathe as the wind was knocked out of him. He looked in horror as Vader lifted the remains of the statue into the air and slammed them down upon Caseus, who pushed them back, holding them with all his might as they inched closer and closer. Closing his eyes, Caseus drew upon every ounce of strength he had and screamed, unleashing a mighty repulse that sent the pieces of the statue flying in every direction. Vader held his guard up and sliced through the incoming pieces before looking back to Caseus, who stood slowly and grabbed his lightsaber.
Your strength weakens.
Caseus held his blade up and stared at Vader. I'm still breathing. Come on, Skywalker. Vader clenched the hilt of his saber and rushed towards Caseus, who ran forward to meet him. The blades collided in a shower of sparks and flashes of blinding light. Caseus knew Vader was right. His strength was failing, but he kept his focus. deflecting every strike he could and holding off the might of Vader as long as possible. Liara had finally reached the freighter and used the Force to open the ramp as she ran inside. Taking the controls, she hesitated. This was it. She looked out of the viewport at the distant tomb and shut her eyes tight before taking off into the sky. Looking at the previous flight path, she saw it. Yavin 4. Setting the coordinates, she placed her hand on the lightspeed controls. Then, she pulled the lever and jumped into hyperspace. In the tomb, Caseus blocked another strike from Vader and backed up. Then, he stopped. He felt Liara's presence leave Chandrila. She was gone. Caseus looked around at the tomb, appearing as though lost in a trance. Vader kept his guard up and looked at him. If this was some strategy, it was new to him. Caseus looked at Vader, and to the shock of the Dark Lord, he shut off his saber and tossed it aside. Vader stood motionless and stared at his adversary.
So, you admit defeat?
Caseus looked at Vader. It's over. Liara is gone. She's safe. Vader gripped his blade tighter.
She will never be safe from me.
I've taught her all she needs. I'm done fighting. You, on the other hand, as much as you try to snuff us out, the Jedi will live on, Anakin. In the end, they always will. In this moment, Vader rushed at Caseus, and with one mighty thrust, the Sith blade impaled Caseus through his stomach. Caseus gasped and clenched his teeth as he felt the searing pain overtake him. As Vader removed his saber, Caseus fell to his knees. He could feel himself fading. This was it. This is where he would die. Vader shut off his saber and loomed over his defeated foe.
You have failed, Caseus. Die, with the assurance that Liara's death will be the same as yours.
Vader turned and began to walk out, until he heard a small chuckle from Caseus. Vader turned as Caseus hung his head, his life quickly fading. All of your power, and yet you lack the foresight to see. You did exactly what I wanted you to do. Suddenly, Caseus raised his arms as the tomb began to shake. Calling out with the last of his power, Caseus gripped the weakened pillars with the Force and shattered them. Vader looked up in shock as the entire tomb began to collapse around them. Goodbye, Skywalker. Vader swiftly ran towards the entrance of the tomb as enormous pieces of rock and mountain began to fall upon him, pummeling him, smashing his body, and burying him just feet from the exit. Caseus sat on his knees as the tomb crumbled and fell all around him. Looking up, Caseus saw his demise. Then, he closed his eyes and let go. There is no death. There is the Force. The deafening shockwave echoed throughout the mountains. Then all was still. Caseus Urshan was no more. From the tons of rubble, a low rumbling came as Vader forced his way out of the wreckage and debris. His armor was shattered, his bones broken, and his breathing labored and raspy. But he stood Stumbling forward, he looked back to the tomb and then made his way to his fighter. As Liara flew through hyperspace, she clutched at her chest and fell from her seat to her knees. She knew what happened. Caseus was gone. He was dead. She cried and smashed her fist on the floor of the freighter. It shouldn't have been this way. She wasn't supposed to lose him like this. All of this was wrong. And yet all of it was real. She couldn't breathe through her sobbing. She just laid on the floor and mourned. On Yavin 4, Guidom sat with Bendel, Tosa, and Pip. None of them had heard anything, but Guidom felt something. He didn't understand it, but he felt a hollow, empty feeling and clutched at his head.
Guidom? You okay?
Before Guidom could answer, he felt something else. A familiar presence. Colonel, Caseus Urshan is requesting permission to land. Guidom nodded and ran with the others to the hangar, where a group of rebel soldiers gathered. The ramp opened, but no one stepped out.
Caseus! Caseus, are you there?
Slowly from off the ship stepped Liara, still clad in her Imperial armor. The rebels immediately aimed their weapons as she stepped forward.
Hold it! Don't move!
Wait!
Bendel ran over and stood a few feet from Liara, who looked at him with a sorrowful gaze.
Liara?
Without another word, Liara threw herself at Bendel and dropped to her knees, sobbing and crying. Bendel quickly knelt in front of her and held her.
Liara, where's Caseus?
Liara said nothing. She only wept. Bendel put the pieces together and shut his eyes as he held on to Liara. Guidom came over along with Pip as they helped Liara up and took her to medical. Light. That was all Caseus saw. Light and stars. Stars that seemed to stretch to infinity. All around him, he saw nothing but the grandeur of an ever-expanding cosmos that he had never even dreamt was possible. Caseus was dead. He knew that. He had accepted it. Yet as he watched the stars stretch and the light grow, he found his eyes overwhelmed by a glow so vibrant he thought he may be blinded. It seemed as though all of time and space vanished before his very eyes. Then, there was only white. Caseus looked down. He saw his body. A physical form. For a moment, he looked around and saw nothing. Then, a vague image came into view. Something he hadn't laid eyes on in nearly 20 years. There, pristine and white, glowing with a beauty he had only ever experienced in his dreams, was the Jedi Temple. Slowly, Caseus walked towards the steps and began to climb them. While he walked, he felt as though any aches and pains in his muscles and bones began to disappear. As he reached the top, a sensation came to him. Looking down at his arm, he was shocked to see that not only did he see flesh and bone, rather than the cybernetic he had become accustomed to, but there was not a wrinkle, scar, or scrape on his hand. Touching his face, his skin felt soft and smooth. He was whole. He was as he was before the fall of the Jedi. As his fingers softly felt his cheeks, he heard a voice.
Caseus.
Looking to the entrance of the temple, Caseus saw Master Takai smiling with pride and joy. Caseus, without thinking, ran to his master and threw his arms around her as she returned the gesture. He felt the comforting embrace of his master and wept upon her shoulder. Master Takai held him close and put her forehead against his.
I'm so proud of you, Caseus.
Caseus smiled and wiped away his tears, looking upon her. I just can't believe Master Takai held his shoulders and looked upon the boy she raised.
I said years ago, Caseus, that you were a greater Jedi than I. You've proven me right.
Caseus smiled and bowed his head respectfully. Master, Liara. Master Takai smiled and tightened her grip.
You've done all you can. Liara will be fine. You've taught her all she needs to know. Liara will continue to grow. Because of you, she's been gifted a second chance.
Caseus thought about Liara and closed his eyes, smiling. I wouldn't have made it without you, Master. I owe everything to your teachings. Master Takai grinned and put her hand on his back, ushering him into the temple.
Not just me, Caseus. Go on. There's a few others who want to see you.
Caseus nodded and started to walk through the familiar halls of his old home. Everything was so clean, so clear, as though crafted from crystal and silver. As he reached the windows that once gave a pristine view of the city, he saw someone standing by the windows. A man with long black hair and a black beard. As he turned around, Caseus saw Dravok, his appearance no longer rough and disheveled, and his demeanor no longer cold and heartless. Caseus looked upon the man he once called his enemy, as Dravok smiled and nodded his head.
Well done, boy.
Without saying a word, Caseus smiled back and bowed in respect to Dravok, who calmly turned his gaze back to the window. Caseus didn't know why, but in a strange way, he was happy to see him again. As he continued walking, he made his way to the training grounds and saw a blossoming tree, its petals falling and disappearing in small puffs of glowing light. There was someone there. As Caseus stepped closer, his heart skipped a beat as Corbin Roth turned to him.
Caseus.
Caseus felt a wave of joy wash over him as the two brothers ran to each other and hugged. Caseus wanted to cry, but instead, he started to laugh. Corbin as well laughed as the two looked at each other. Corbin, I'm so glad to see you.
You did good, Caseus. Good job.
Caseus wiped a tear and looked at him. Corbin, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that...
No, Caseus, you have nothing to apologize for. I sacrificed myself to save you, and you didn't let it go to waste. You fought until the end. Now Liara will carry on your teachings. She owes everything to you.
Caseus looked at Corbin and put his hand on his shoulder. I know. Corbin chuckled.
Hey, what are you doing here with me? We got all the time in the world. There's someone else who wants to see you.
Caseus' heart beat fast as Corbin pointed upwards to the top of the temple. Turning and running as fast as he could up the temple steps, he reached his old quarters and went out the window onto the ledge. Soon, he reached the ladder and climbed until he reached the top. Golden light shone all around as he looked ahead. There, sitting on the edge, a young woman with raven black hair. Caseus felt a wellspring of emotions fill every cell in his body as he slowly walked over. Sarah? Slowly, the woman stood and turned to face him, as she smiled the same cocky smile that he remembered.
Took you long enough.
Caseus slowly approached Sarah, looking upon her as though witnessing her beauty for the first time. Then, he wrapped his arms around her, as tears flowed down his cheeks. Feeling Sarah's embrace, Caseus' heart melted. Please, tell me this is real. Looking up at him, Sarah gently took hold of his cheeks and looked into his eyes.
Does this answer your question?
Pulling him close, Sarah kissed him. Caseus slowly closed his eyes and returned the embrace, holding her tight, as he felt the love he had once felt for her envelop him once again. After a few moments, Caseus broke the kiss and smiled to her. I missed you so much, Sarah.
I know, but you're here now.
Caseus held Sarah's cheek in his hand and looked into her eyes before holding her tight as she rested her head upon his chest. Caseus, the Padawan, the exile, the master, was finally back where he belonged. Back where he always dreamt of being. Surrounded by those he loved. Looking out at the golden light, Caseus smiled. Finally and forever. At peace. Liara sat on a bed, her hair wet from her time in the Bacta tank. She was completely numb. No longer crying, only because she no longer had the energy. The door opened as Gaidom stepped in, dismissing the rebels accompanying him. Liara? Liara looked at Gaidom and back to her feet. He's gone, isn't he? Liara said nothing and nodded. His eyes full of sorrow, Gaidom sighed and sat in front of Liara. I had a feeling he wasn't coming back. Liara.
I know he's one with the Force now. I should be happy that he's at peace now. He told me it had to be this way.
Liara looked at Gaidom.
So why does it hurt so much?
It always hurts to lose someone we love. Even the strongest Jedi isn't free from the burden of loss. Liara, what you've been through over the years. At your age. I can't lie to you and say things will get better. You have a long road ahead of you. But because of him, you have that chance. Caseus spoke so fondly of you, Liara. You meant so much to him. Liara closed her eyes and stayed silent. Gaidom could see she didn't want to talk anymore. Standing up, he walked to the corner of the room and handed her a box with Caseus' belongings. Caseus left these here. I think it's only right that they go to you. Setting the box down, Gaidom looked at Liara before leaving, as the door shut behind him. Liara looked at the box and pulled out the contents. Master Takai's cloak. He took such good care of it. As she felt the fabric, she could feel the pain ease ever so softly. Master Takai's book. All the lessons she had learned from it swam through her mind as she skimmed the tattered pages. There were a few lessons and techniques she never got around to learning. Her lightsaber. The one Caseus had given to her on Chandrila. Still in good condition. Activating it, she looked upon the deep blue blade before putting it away. She saw her small wooden cube that Caseus gave to her as a child. It used to be her favorite thing in the world. The final item was one she hadn't seen before. The holocron. Picking it up, she felt the cold metal. She could feel its energy resonating through her. It was a Jedi relic. She softly floated it in her hand and was surprised when it began to open in front of her. As she concentrated, a hollow recording of Caseus flickered into view. Liara watched as her eyes fixed on the face of her master.
My name is Caseus Urshan, Jedi Knight. I'm recording this message to tell my story. Years ago, I served the Jedi Order in its darkest era. I was like any other Padawan. I had a master. I had friends. I had a purpose. That all changed on the final day of the Clone Wars. Everyone who I grew alongside, that I admired, my teachers, my friends, the woman I loved, all were killed that day, with precious few survivors. I was one of those unlucky few forced to witness the rise of the Empire and the destruction of all that the Republic and the Jedi stood for. In my desire for vengeance against the one responsible, Darth Vader, I foolishly tried to end his terror on the planet Castellon. And I failed. I had never felt the crushing weight of my own hubris more in my life than in the hour of my defeat. What's more, my actions resulted in the deaths of many good souls. I fled to Dantooine, where I hid for 8 years in the home of a kind soul named Sabo. It was here, in the shadow of my failure, my light was rekindled when I met a young girl named Liara. Liara, I found, was strong with the Force, and I took it upon myself to train her. We left Dantooine after I was discovered by an Inquisitor. I trained Liara as well as I could, but I was ill-prepared for how powerful she would become, and how difficult the duty of a master can be. After a few years, and after moving from planet to planet, desperately trying to evade the Empire, we found ourselves wrapped up with this rebellion. An alliance of insurgents bent on overthrowing the Empire and restoring peace to the galaxy. For so long I refused to join, believing the Empire too great a threat to be overcome. But we joined, aiding where we could. On a mission to Bakura, after putting an end to Minister Lok Tambon, Liara and I were captured by enemies I had made over the years. Enemies I clearly underestimated. Liara was killed in front of me, and I, a broken man with nothing, was enslaved on Kessel for nearly 4 years. My allies in the Alliance freed me, and shamefully, I lusted for vengeance, giving in to urges no Jedi should ever foster. And in doing so, I hurt others, people close to me. Once again, in my hubris and anger, I allowed the dark side to control me, all for a needless desire to hurt those who wronged me. It was soon after when I found that Liara wasn't dead. Liara had been taken by the Empire, tortured, and twisted to the dark side by Vader. These events have shown me that I'm not a great and mighty Jedi hero. I'm not some savior of the innocent. I'm just a man. But I'm a man with a responsibility. There is still light inside of Liara. I know it. And I have to reach her. Within the hour, I'll be leaving to confront her. I've tried to meditate, to see what my future will hold. But my vision is clouded. It's likely that I'm walking to my death. To anyone listening to this recording, I offer only this wisdom. However uncertain our destinies may be, fighting to avoid or change them is not the way. I've lived my life for nearly 20 years in constant fear of where my path will lead me. Looking to the next day, all while dreading what will come. Running. Hiding. Trying so desperately to stray from a path that was set before me long before I was born. No longer. This day, I put my trust in the Force. And Liara, if you're listening to this, whatever happens, I want you to know how sorry I am for everything that happened to you. You were the daughter I never had. I love you. And I am so proud of you. Never forget that. My name is Caseus Urshan, Jedi Knight. May the Force be with you. Always.
The recording ended, and Liara's eyes overflowed with tears. Then, she smiled, as memories of her years training with Caseus filled her mind. His training, his humor, his compassion. Closing the holocron, she stored it away and stood up. Outside in the hangar, Pip sat on the wing of the Nebulous. His captain was gone. Now he was the captain. That was a big responsibility for him. As he looked around, he saw Liara walking over to the ship, looking upon the craft in which they once traveled the stars.
Liara!
Pip hopped off and face-planted onto the ground before getting up and rushing to Liara, who smiled as she knelt down and hugged him.
Hey, Pip.
Pip looked up at her.
I'm glad you're back, Liara. Caseus would be proud of you.
I know. Pip, there's something I need to tell you.
You're leaving, aren't you?
Liara closed her eyes and nodded.
I can't stay here. I can't. I need time to think things over. And...
Hey. No need to explain it, Liara. I understand. You need to get away from all of this. But promise me that when you need help, you give Captain Pip a call. Okay?
Liara chuckled as she gave Pip one more hug. As she did, she saw Bendel and Tosa talking. Standing up, she made her way over.
Bendel.
Bendel turned to her and smiled. How are you?
I'll be okay. Listen. I told Pip, and I'll tell Gaiadome too. But I'm leaving.
Leaving?
I know. But this is how it has to be. If I stay, I could cause more trouble. Vader's still out there. It's best for me to keep my distance and lay low for a while.
Bendel wanted to object, but he knew her mind was made up. So, this is it?
Listen. About what I did. Everything. To you, the Arabella, Kresh.
Bendel patted her shoulder. It's okay. Kresh wouldn't hold it against you if he were here. Neither do I. As for the Arabella, well, it was a ship.
A good ship, but... well, you know. I'm just glad you're back.
Liara smiled.
Me too.
Bendel shook her hand as Liara smiled to him. Bendel felt a scaly elbow jab his shoulder as Tosa leaned in.
Tell her, you idiot.
Liara. There's something I have to tell you.
Liara didn't even let him get the words out before she leaned in and kissed his lips. Bendel's face turned red as he wrapped his arms around her.
I love you too.
Liara looked at Tosa and scratched her head.
About your arm.
It'll grow back. Just don't try it on my head. That'll be a bit trickier.
Liara scoffed and smiled as she looked at Bendel before going to her quarters to prepare.
There's that kiss I mentioned earlier.
Shut up, Tosa.
The day drew to an end, and Liara grabbed her gear and a fresh change of clothes. She was ready to go. There was just one thing left to do. Walking outside to the edge of the rainforest, she found Gaidom sitting by a small stone set in a small garden. The name of Caseus etched onto it.
Hey, Gaidom.
Gaidom turned around and smiled.
You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Where are you gonna go?
Liara smiled and thought.
Home.
Gaidom nodded and took her hand.
I wish you all the luck in the world, Liara.
Thank you, Gaidom.
As Gaidom patted her back, a loud whistle drew their attention as Sanja waved.
General Press needs us in 5 minutes. Hurry!
Gaidom nodded as Liara looked at him.
She's coming along well. Boy or girl?
Boy.
Any name ideas?
Gaidom smiled.
I have one in mind.
Soon, Liara had made her final preparations and stood on the ramp of the mineral freighter. Turning around, she looked at her friends, who waved and smiled.
Liara, may the Force be with you.
Liara nodded, feeling her spirits lift as the ramp closed, and she got into the cockpit, taking off into the skies. The dark side surrounded Vader as he soaked in his bacta tank. His eyes shut, his mind focused on the task that had been set before him as soon as he arrived. The one bit of solace he could take was that Caseus was dead. One less loose end to worry about. He could finally focus his attention on matters of more importance. Still, Liara was alive. She could be trouble. She knew nothing of the Empire's ultimate secret. That, at least, was assurance that their plans were not yet entirely compromised. As he soaked, he thought about what Caseus said, that he would meet his end by a Jedi. He shut the thought down. No Jedi was his equal. And he would see to it that that day never came. Suddenly, the door to his chamber opened as a man in a dark cloak entered, kneeling before the tank.
My lord, Director Krennic has arrived.
Liara's ship soon arrived and set down in the lush green fields of grain. Dantooine. She was home. Up ahead, she saw the village. A few more shops and houses had since popped up. But it was home. Taking a deep breath, she walked until she came to the front step of her home. Slowly, she knocked. The door opened, and a woman with red hair answered. Her eyes grew wide as she found herself looking upon her daughter.
Hey, Mom.
The early morning sun rose over the fields of grain. A young boy with dark brown skin was busy standing on his hands as a few small stones floated around him.
Master, am I done yet?
Liara sat in meditation, her master's cloak flowing behind her in the breeze.
Not yet, Coven. Deep breaths. Concentrate.
The boy nodded and stayed still as a stone as he concentrated. Liara looked upon her student and smiled. 4 years ago, she returned home. She told her mother all about her travels, her journeys, and all of the hardships she went through. But those troubles were now only memories. Old wounds that had begun to fade like the scars on her face. She missed Caseus. She missed him every day. But now, she had a chance to make him proud. She was now training an apprentice of her own. She had met him while helping her uncle with some farm work a few years prior. Just like her, Coven was a young child with untapped potential in the Force, and she would do her part in making sure he received care and training. As Coven concentrated, his balance was suddenly broken by the sound of an incoming ship. Falling over onto the grass, he looked up as his eyes made out an X-Wing landing nearby. Liara looked at it as Coven stood and walked over to her.
What's the rebellion doing here?
Liara put her hand on Coven's shoulder.
Go on inside, Coven. Get some water. We'll start again in an hour.
Coven nodded and left Liara's side. The hatch of the X-Wing opened as a young man with blonde hair stepped out.
Stay with the ship, R2.
I won't be long. The man adjusted his tunic and walked over to where Liara was standing. Are you Liara Sinda?
I am.
It took a little while for me to find you. Colonel Haywicken told me you'd be here. I should introduce myself. I'm Luke Skywalker. Liara smiled.
I know who you are. Word doesn't travel too fast out here, but you've become quite a legend.
Luke nodded. I assume you know why I'm here then.
I have my theory.
Luke walked alongside her into the field. With the Empire defeated, I have a responsibility to undo the damage caused by Vader and the Emperor. I have a job to rebuild the Jedi Order, to start over and help the Jedi rise once again. But it's going to be difficult, and I'll need as much help as I can get. Liara pondered his words.
Did you speak to Colonel Haywicken?
I did, although he's taking time to think it over. He has a family now, and he's not sure if it's the right time just yet. That's why he sent me here to you. If you're willing to help me, together, we can bring the Jedi back. Liara looked into the field and over to Coven, who was gathering water from the well.
I appreciate the offer, Luke. But I'm going to have to decline for right now. I spent many years training as a Jedi. And I spent a few years trapped within the embrace of the dark side. I still wake up some nights, feeling the pain of what I went through. I have a student of my own now. I'm doing my best to help him control his abilities.
Luke looked over at Coven and back to Liara. What about the Jedi? The galaxy needs them.
Yes, but the galaxy doesn't need me right now. What they need is a true Jedi who can help lead the galaxy into a new era for the Jedi. For now, my place is here, looking after my family, my apprentice, and my people.
Luke took a moment and looked at the field and back to his X-Wing. I understand. Liara looked at Luke.
Thank you, Luke. In the future, who knows? The Force holds many mysteries. If you need me, you know where to find me.
Luke nodded as he and Liara bowed respectfully to each other. As Luke turned and walked back to his ship, he stopped and turned back. Before I go, you must have had a master. Who? Liara stopped and looked back to Luke.
His name was Caseus.
As she said this, a gentle breeze blew past her hair. Looking out into the field, she saw a faint, glowing figure with the face of her master, smiling, watching over her.